Okay, so I want to introduce our guest today, Catherine Keller. She is a contemporary theologian and professor of constructive theology at Drew University's Graduate Division of Religion. And please, Catherine, if I get any of this wrong, you can correct me, of course. As a constructive theologian, Keller's work is oriented around social and ecological justice, poststructuralist theory, and feminist readings of scripture and theology. Her work brings relational thinking into theology, focusing on the relational nature of the divine and the forms of ecological interdependence within the framework of relational theology. Her work in process theology draws on the work of Alfred North Whitehead and brings it into a postmodern deconstructive framework. So, Catherine, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, Matthew, I'm glad to be part of this weirdness that you are putting out into the world.
Thank you so much. So, speaking of weirdness, when I started this podcast, it mainly was, I started it as a way to talk to people about basically weird experiences that they've had. And it's kind of morphed into something else now where I kind of just use it as an excuse to talk to people about their spirituality in general. But I try to have at least one question about weird experiences. So I wanted to start off that way. So I'm wondering, are there any mysterious or mystical or unusual or synchronistic experiences from your life that you would be willing to share with us?
Well, yeah, my life was just constantly weird, frankly. So it all works a little differently for me, for various fairly traumatic reasons. My family had to move every couple of years, and that included a lot of the globe. So there was adventure in that, but there was constant crisis and weirdness, strangeness, being strangers. So theology didn't really call to me as a voice of weirdness, but not as a voice of normalcy either. But I think of meaningfulness within the infinite weird. So the synchronicities that have meant the most to me have often been, quite low key, like bumping into just the right book at just the right moment to set me on what turns out to be the right path. The big one for me was the way I bumped into John Cobb's book, Christ in a Pluralistic Age, at a moment when I really didn't know where I was going to go with an adult life, but I was being drawn to the community that theology, that some forms of liberal Christianity seemed to offer, and there was more feminism there, but I couldn't really deal with this sort of Christ thing that seemed to dominate and seemed oddly idolatrous to me, turning this person into God. Because Buddhism had been very important to my survival as a teenager, actually. But it was finding this text of John Cobb's, just happened to be there on a bookshelf in the basement of the school I was at, that opened Christianity out of Buddhism, really got to me. John's attitude is without Buddha, he could not be a Christian.
Yeah.
Because the Buddha helps to empty Christianity of all of the imperial and fundamentalist accretions, and a kind of selfishness that goes with a lot of Christianity, like salvation is all about my relationship to God. So that connection of a very early naive Buddhism on my part then to a form of Christianity was probably the big calling. And there was just a lot of coincidence in how I happened to find that book at that moment, how I happened to be in the school I was in, how there happened to be a teacher there, an older guy, way older, really got me, even though I was a very chaotic, confused young person. He really saw the potential and reached in there and had no sexism in it. This is, the mid-70s, so that's pretty cool.
Mhm.
That he was just so beyond any sexism. So that's not an exotic experience, but it's the one that made my path possible.
Yeah. Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, I mean, I I feel like a lot of my most meaningful synchronicities are similar to that. It's not necessarily exotic, and I think it's probably unhealthy to only think of synchronicities as exotic or something like that. And for me, it has revolved around books as well, So to this day, for years and years, like sometimes I'll get a book that I feel like I need to read, but I'll start reading it and I just kind of feel like I'm not ready to read it yet. And maybe I'll go through certain experiences or read other books and then come back to that book, and then the timing feels right. And also, I might read a book that references another author, another book, and then it kind of sends me down this really meaningful rabbit hole or something. And so there is something very synchronistic about that strange organic kind of chain of influences that come from books. My next question is kind of related to, I think it's related to your discovery of John Cobb, because I've heard you talk about how one thing that resonated with you from that book that you talked about there was his focus on abstract art,
Oh,
and
yeah.
how when you were growing up, abstract art was a big presence in your life. And so I'm just curious, like, can you say a bit about your relationship to abstract art, and maybe how that primed you for process theology?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's through my weird family that I came into it, because my mother very much wanted for a while to be a painter in a very abstract mode. And she did go to St. Louis, Washington U Art School, and met my father there, my blood father, who was Milton Cohen, not Jules Keller, who she later married. And they were both painters in a very abstract mode. So I was conceived in the midst of all of that abstraction. And so probably I am an abstract work because of that.
Yeah.
But there was intensity and flamboyance and defiance in that abstraction for my mother, as a woman, who came of age during the Second World War, and really therefore, and very soon thereafter, and so had very little opportunities because the vets all came home and the women were pushed out of their jobs, and career paths by and large became much more difficult. So there was all that defiance and hopefulness and energy that I was exposed to. So even though we had to move a lot from one place to the next, we would always get pulled along to the art museum, and at this point, I do have to admit, I have very old-fashioned tastes, like Kandinsky and Paul Klee are no doubt my favorites, and that came out of that childhood. It was all tragically tainted, because my mother couldn't, once she had me, she couldn't go on as a painter. There weren't the funds, there wasn't the support for that, and ultimately my father dumped her because he wanted to be an artist. Artists create, they don't procreate. He announced. So she had to give all that up, but still kept the sort of tragic love of it. And I only have splashed around with actually painting occasionally, just on the side, just really making sure I don't get trapped in that. But yes, John Cobb's appeal to Malraux, in the sense that as art in the West in the 18th, 19th century begins to really get free of the images of Christ, a new kind of creative transformation is going on. And for Malraux, that's getting free of Christendom in those images. And what my teachers at John Cobb said is, yes, it's getting rid of that Christendom and its imposition. But for Cobb, it's actually Christ as creative transformation that's quietly behind that transformation, that there's some way in which the Christ element of the universe wills a creativity that frees itself from the fixation on Christ.
Right.
And of course, I love that. And that opens the field to, what one could call a Christianity that's a lot more like abstract art, more than it is like all the beautiful medieval icons of Jesus and all the other saints. And I respect and even in some way love all that history of art and its icons, but without that burst of energetic creativity that frees one from the given forms and boundaries of perception and of affect and of social order, then Christendom just becomes an oppressive force. But in the force field of that freedom, then the radical side of it can come through again. So that was at work with me in that imagery.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted, I guess, just as a tiny little side note, because I didn't I guess I didn't realize that you had a Buddhist influence early on, and I'm also very influenced by Buddhism, so I'm definitely curious about that. So I guess my one question about that is, have you kind of like maintained a active interest in Buddhism, and does it still kind of like inform your spirituality?
Yes, it does, but not a formal sort. I was just on the phone for an hour yesterday with the director of a certain Zen institute that I won't particularly name because a student of mine might end up working there. So I was discussing how the background in theology would serve someone working in a Zen center.
Yeah.
And I loved the conversation, because this director of the Zen Center also came out to me as, still recovering Catholic.
Okay.
And it's just clear for a lot of us, Buddhism helps us get released from oppressive forms of religion, and particularly oppressive forms of Christianity. It empties us out of them. For the person I was talking to yesterday, that certainly meant becoming a Buddhist practitioner. For me, it's involved a very much more casual kind of meditation, but my life is never without that sense of the breathing and the emptying, and the silencing of all those ego demands and the internalized demands of the world and its markets that have consumed us. So Buddhism just feels very existentially immediate in that way of emptying. But I don't teach Buddhism. I teach forms of theology, largely Christian, that are influenced by Buddhism and that point to the importance, of the engagement.
Right.
But I will say, I was just looking at a text the other day, just a marvelous little gift. Someone gave me a little booklet by Thich Nhat Hanh, and I just found real joy in an image there about how when the baby Buddha was born, he took 7 steps right after birth, and a lotus flower appeared under each step, and Thich Nhat Hanh offers this as an image for walking meditation, that as you're breathing and walking, just imagine, some flower, some lotus or tulip blooming.
Yeah.
Under each step of yours. And I thought, I want to take this into my late August walks.
Yeah, that's a beautiful image. Yeah, Thich Nhat Hanh, he was a gentle soul, and I liked how he has that, maybe the book you were referring to. Living Buddha, Living Christ, I think is the name of it.
This one is just a little one called "The Long Road Turns to Joy," but I think it's an excerpt from just that book. I bet.
Okay.
A bunch of excerpts that are about walking meditation that my friend gave me.
Nice. Well, another kind of, I guess, figure that I want to ask you about is Carl Jung. And he's somebody I just, since maybe my first year of college, I just feel something keeps pulling me toward him. I can't quite get away from him no matter where I go. And I think a lot of people feel that way. He kind of like haunts us or something. But yeah, so I guess I'm just curious about, what is it about Jungian psychology that maybe seems useful to you? And specifically, I guess one of the things about Jung that has stuck with me so much is just like archetypes,
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, do what, do you kind of consciously think about archetypes much? And if so, how does that affect your own spiritual life?
Oh, Matthew, that's a complicated question.
I know it's a big one. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yes, you should apologize. Big question. Tolerate those in theology. But, listening. So, if I'm honest, Jung was right in there with Buddhism as a very early influence on me too. And you must have seen that I had a chapter on Jung in my first book, From a Broken Web, but nothing really since, because Jung has been so taboo in the academic world that it just hasn't been worth trying to push on that angle. And I'm not an expert in Jung, and I'm not a psychologist. So for me, it's been more indirect in my writing and teaching, but there's no question that the archetypes had a dramatic, illuminating effect on my life early on. And that notion of synchronicity, of course, that's how the infinite weird
Right.
into our life. And for me, that synchronicity has always seemed present and gentle, and finding Jung was an aspect of that. And even like the notion of the anima and the animus, very taboo academically. I can go into that more if you think your listeners care about that, but
Sure.
because it was used a lot by Jungians in a way that seemed to foster the stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, and make them eternal. Eternal feminine, eternal masculine, and the feminine turns out to be receptive and emotional and sensitive and corporeal. The masculine turns out to be rigorous and rational, etc.
Right.
So I get the problem with the stereotypes, and you can't lightly touch on those archetypes of masculine and feminine, or else it goes that way. But synchronistically, I ended up fairly late in life marrying a guy who focuses on music. He's trained in classical music and does documentaries about classical music, Jason Starr. And right now he's working on, it's his 7th documentary on Gustav Mahler, and actually on the 8th Symphony, where the whole last segment of Faust II is set to an incredible chorale. This is the Symphony for 1,000. But the last verse that's sung is Das ewig Weiblich zieht uns hinein. Das ewige Weibliche zieht uns hinein. The eternal feminine pulls us onward. And it's in the context of the appearance of Mater Gloriosa, and she's the final appearance of the divine in Goethe's enormous work that begins much more Job-like, with a very masculine lord, and it ends there. No masculine lord anywhere, but this goddess form of the divinity, the ultimate force of the universe, and the verse the eternal feminine pulls us onward.
Mm.
Well, how can one bat that away as a stereotype? No, that's an imagery of the archetype, the female archetype, as an ultimacy that isn't just a receptive goal. It's also that, because there she is to receive us, but it's what's pulling us, it's what's motivating and driving, right? So I've just been preoccupied with that a little bit, because I'll have to be one of the commentators in Jason's film. I always do that. I turn myself into an expert on Gustav Mahler for a few weeks each time he does one of these documentaries, so I can say what he needs me to say. But this has been really haunting me, and of course, Goethe was of great importance to Carl Jung, well, to most German-speaking intellectuals,
Mm-hmm.
and so this sense haunts my life in a rather synchronistic way, and I want to keep pushing back against making the archetype into a stereotype.
Right.
Because women should be tough, they should be strong, they should be stubborn, they should be physically rough when they want to be, they should be super sharp, and they can be all of those other attributes of nurturing, intuitiveness as well, right? And men should be both too.
Yep.
And that's Jung's point. It's
Yep.
just to work his way through language to that point, he was drawing on images that easily get stereotyped. So there you have it. The complex story of my Jung, but he doesn't go away.
Yeah. No, that I resonate with that a lot, because I am drawn to, for lack of a better way to put it, like the divine masculine and divine feminine, because we see it with the yin and the yang, we see it with Shiva and Shakti, the anima and animus. Yep. And yeah, I like you said, Jung's point was that we contain both of those within us, and we have to kind of nourish and activate the other side if that side has been repressed and all that stuff, which I agree with that, but I also see your point about the danger of the archetype, kind of feeding stereotypes, and it's tricky territory. I guess as a last question about the archetypal stuff, when you were talking about kind of the maybe expressions of Christ shifting from more like iconography to maybe abstract art. So do you see Christ as an archetype?
I think that's meaningful language. It's not language I would normally, again, use or even necessarily think of, because but yes, I think you could say with Jung that Christ is the archetype of probably the main expression of the archetype of the self in at least Western civilization. Makes that point rather strongly. And I do see Christ as an expression of the heart of the universe. So what is called logos biblically, the word, but the word not in the sense of mere verbiage, but kind of the cosmic first principle. And that's the word that is in the beginning, and is expressed, and it's in the beginning in Genesis, not named Christ, but just is the speaking into being, and that speech is a word that we have for a kind of crystallized meaning that emanates into the truth of everything that is, and that gives form to the creativity. And I think one can talk about Christ in terms of that sort of logos or word of cosmology. That's a symbolization that's very archetypal, and one has to be careful with it, because that's the sort of high Christology, the cosmic Christology, that can also be used, as an exclusivist Christian hammer, like we've got the secret to reality. So it has to be worked at carefully. But on the whole, conservative Christians aren't that interested in the cosmic logos. They're not that
Right.
interested in the cosmos. They're more interested in the ongoing creativity of the creation and in how perhaps that logos calls us to partake of it. But what's very important to me also is that that we have an understanding of what Christ means as that which is incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth, this working class carpenter, this Jew who got nailed rather horrifically only 3 years into his mission. Why was he such a threat to the powers that be, the imperial powers, the powers of Rome? Why did Rome need to be rid of him? So I'm very interested in all the forms of liberation theology that have lifted up the social political power of the teaching of Jesus to emancipate us, to call us from freedom from oppressive structures, especially of power and of greed, meaning neoliberal capitalism these days. But that calling to free us up from the particular forms of mammon that haunt today seems crucial, but it's a positive call to treat others as you want them to treat you, right?
Yep.
And that's a very down-to-earth way of understanding what love is. It's very unsentimental. It's not about how you feel. Your feelings matter if they're honest feelings and if you express them with care. And if you do, then you'll find yourself working that love in the form of respect for those whom it's really hard to relate to, therefore, not just for your friends and family, but for those strangers, even those enemies. You don't bow down to them. You don't succumb to your enemies, but you you hold them accountable for being human. You believe they're human, and to treat them with respect means to call out something better, to give them that chance to show that they're capable of also being respectful. So I work a lot with that very ethical on the ground sense of Jesus, as well as the more mystical reverberation of that love, and that sense that what God means is not a big daddy in the sky, not some person, but actually what God means is love, that process, that activity. And that sense that Christ is embodying that love in this particular incarnation, calling us not to just bow down and worship him. He was so interested in that. He was interested in how we would treat others.
Yes.
How we would honor him. We would only honor him through how we relate to the widow, the pauper, the homeless person.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. Yeah, those are kind of the two main streams of approaching Christianity that resonate the most with me as well. And I probably am going to get this wrong, but some of what you said reminded me of a line from one of the Gospels about like, if you only greet your own kind, then I can't remember the end of it. Like, if you only greet your own kind, then, you're no better than whatever. Like, just this emphasis on, being willing and able and drawn to basically seeing the humanity in everybody, especially when they're different.
Yep.
And so thank you for sharing that. Okay, my next question is shifting gears a little bit, but all of this stuff overlaps. So For me personally, in the last several years, I've been like drawn to both pantheism and panentheism.
Uh-huh.
And and I think I know that you've talked about and written about panentheism, and there are kind of versions of panentheism that really resonate with me, and there are versions of pantheism that do. And sometimes I feel like I'm kind of like I can't quite decide where I land on that spectrum. And it kind of depends on how we define each one. But so I guess I'm wondering, what is it about panentheism that seems more useful and maybe more accurate to you than pantheism?
Well, that's a fun question. And so you talked on your podcast about panentheism before, so you just
Hmm.
use that vocabulary. Great. How reassuring. So, I mean, I locate myself very capaciously as a panentheist. Uh, I prefer it to straight classical theism, uh, which is just the, the theism apart from the, over and against the pan, the all, because that's a dualistic and non-credible concept of God as sort of out there and up there and merely transcendent of us all, somehow in control, manipulating us towards his greater ends directly and indirectly. And that's non-credible. And often a spiritually satisfying alternative to people has been in the discovery of something like pantheism, whether it uses that word or not, but just finding that finding divinity or the sacred everywhere,
Hmm.
in everything. But as soon as you say it that way, right, in everything, finding God in all,
Hmm.
you're actually committing panentheism, not
Yeah.
pantheism, right?
Yeah.
Pantheism is saying all is God, God
Hmm.
is all. Panentheism is saying all is in God, God is in all.
Hmm.
And so I just think that has more dynamism and flow. Uh, it does, of course, allow the theos a distinctness, not a separateness, but a distinctness from the all.
Hmm.
So it's a position that has potentially a whole lot in common with the Abrahamic traditions,
Hmm.
and comes out of them, though it can spread anywhere. Whereas pantheism more easily embraces Asian spirituality, and that's why I would never want to draw a line and say I'm a panentheist, not
Hmm.
a pantheist. The thing is, though, in my context, to say you're a pantheist is just to exclude yourself from serious theological conversations, even with so-called liberal Christians, because it's just such a kind of defining thing,
Hmm.
that pantheism that identifies God as the whole
Yeah.
is, well, heretical, some would say, others would say just mistaken. And I would say it can lose the revelatory force of God as what Martin Luther called, what Martin Buber, very different Martin Buber, called thou.
Yeah.
Uh, sometimes I want to refer to God as thou, as you there,
Yeah.
but that you there is in a sense that you all, hey, y'all, but you all, you in all, you as the heart of all. There,
Hmm.
you can't draw a strict line between pantheism and panentheism. Just say they're different rhetorical strategies that are helpful depending on who you're speaking with. There's so
Hmm.
many different ways of being a pantheist. Yeah, for instance. And
Yeah.
right, and so it's more important to me how the metaphors are actually dancing along in there than what label one gives.
Yeah. Yeah. I see that. Yeah, I mean, I guess I am curious about how you said, seeing the divine as distinct but not separate.
Mhm.
And when I think about, if we think about panentheism as seeing the divine as both transcendent and immanent, whereas pantheism is seeing the divine as just purely immanent and not transcendent. So then it makes me always wonder, well, in what ways do I see the divine as transcendent? And, I mean, that can take the form of like the divine transcends any one thing, so and the divine transcends any concept or image or word that we might use to try to define the divine, stuff like that. So I guess just as a last little question about that, in what ways do you see the divine as distinct from the all, and is that related to this notion of the lure in any way?
It's related, but it takes a few steps to get there. But
Okay.
yeah, you could say that the divine is always luring us to self-transcend. And that's the view of the kind of panentheism that I do teach a lot of, called process theology,
Mm-hmm.
from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, but also a great cosmologist. So, and he couldn't help but come upon a certain sense of the divine in there. And
Yeah.
it's the divine as a lure, calling us to actualize greater possibilities, not doing it for us. So that calling, that's something different from what I already am, what you already are.
Mm.
And I suspect it's always more than the sum of all of the parts of the universe.
Yeah.
Something more than the sum, a kind of whole that in that sense transcends the parts, but isn't separate from them. But that saying to transcend is to be more than. And of course, if we're talking about infinity, it's always more than. But that more can get too static. And the transcendence can get too static, again, like the separate sphere up above, beyond. And that's not helpful. It's this whole that would be greater than the sum of all the parts is dynamic. If it's calling, it's desiring. Whitehead called God the eros of the universe, the sort of deepest desire driving everything. But it's a desire, and the creatures have to actualize. We have to make it happen. We're called. We have to do something with our possibilities, with what's given us, and so that lure calls us always to transcend what we have already become.
Yeah.
Become a little more, even if it's just hearing you, Matthew Sherling, a little better than I have, just at this moment, thinking a little beyond where I was. But that's also saying that God is transcending, but in a different sense than just being greater than.
Mm-hmm.
It's that perhaps God also goes beyond the given, that God goes beyond what God already was, that God takes in everything that happens in the universe or the multiverse, this unfathomable, trillions of suns that we can't even begin to think the size of the universe.
Yeah.
And even as a possibly finite thing. And so if there's some whole beyond all of those parts, what is it? Is it just a static container? Well, surely not. Surely it's something of the energy that's calling us to evolve together into more and more interesting creatures. And why? Well, for our sakes, surely. But I would think it's also then for the sake of that divinity, for that God's experience of it all, that God's experience is only rich and fulfilled through infinite relationships, through all these relationships, including those to you and me. And so in that, to say God transcends the world, yes, but that's God also going beyond by having new experiences every moment. So it's a kind of self-transcending of God.
Yeah.
It's not saying God was imperfect at any prior moment. That's not the point. God was perfect in God's wholeness, if perfection means wholeness, at every moment. But it's dynamic. It unfolds. But to say that God changes or becomes in any way has been really strictly taboo for most Abrahamisms most of the time. But that's why I love process theology. And it's sometimes, of course, called Panentheism. Some use that label and some don't, but it's an understanding that God is not just a static being.
Yeah.
What we call God is the ultimate process of becoming. So this is a profoundly mobile deity. If it's a living God, then it's got to be alive in a way that involves a response of taking in to all the free decisions of all the creatures and integrating them somehow within God's own being, and therefore God is becoming.
Right.
And so God is not just luring, but also receiving everything that happens, and that's a becoming God, a God in Genesis, not a static God. That static notion of the divine came into Christianity, out of a certain stereotyped version of Greek philosophy in the first centuries of the Christian formation. And that was the only way that Christians, who were originally all Jews, could speak to other peoples. I mean, they had to speak through some presumptions of Greco-Roman thought, and it had a very static notion of God as changeless being, or the divine as ultimate changeless being. So a lot of that got worked in and through, the biblical stories, which are metaphors, not philosophical propositions.
Right.
And so things got a lot more static and stuck. But the dynamism of that transcending is there. But for Whitehead, it's what does he say at the end of Process and Reality? It's as true to say that that God transcends the world as that the world transcends God. And then he says, and it's as true to say that God is immanent to the world as that the world is immanent to God.
I love that. Yeah, paradoxical. I love I'm drawn to process philosophy and process theology for some of those same reasons, just the emphasis on dynamism and novelty and new possibility. And I like linking that to transcendence. That makes sense to me.
Transcending, just a quick footnote. The word transcend means to move beyond.
Yes.
Go beyond.
Yes. Love it. I love that. I know we have about 15 minutes left. I'm hoping I can ask both of these questions. We'll see if we can get to both of them. The first one, I guess it's kind of a two-part question, but related to something you said previously about you see the danger of certain forms of Christianity being like exclusive, and you kind of try to push against that. And so how do you kind of navigate the tension between preserving your own Christianity, but also not giving into kind of the exclusive nature of some forms of Christianity? I guess I'll just stop there for now with that question.
Oh, well, I couldn't stay a Christian for a minute if I couldn't have freedom from that exclusivism. And fortunately, from age 17 on, I found forms of Christianity that were interreligious, that were philosophical, that were in deep dialogue, like process theology with the natural sciences, the cutting edge of the natural sciences. So I found through the synchronicities of encounter those ways of a theology that refuses that exclusivism as profoundly in violation of Christianity, of the spirit of love. And we recognize that a whole lot of Christianity has been in violation of Christianity, because Christianity went imperial already, in the third, early fourth century. So I can only remain a Christian because I found communities who are identified as Christian, who share that resistance to more exclusivist, supersessionist, arrogant forms of Christianity, and we all, so we help each other, we teach each other how how to read scripture and everything else from this alternative Christian view. And of course, that only works because one stays in communication with all kinds of non-Christian view. And then, through that, one develops some strength, so one can occasionally go into more conservative Christian contexts and have conversations, open them up. I'm not great at that. I have a lot of colleagues and students who are better at that because they grew up fundamentalist or evangelical. They saw through that, they fled that, but then they found that they still had to work through something deeper about, like, to get healed from conservative Christianity, they had to find an alternative Christianity. They weren't satisfied with just the secularism or the atheism. And so we all work together, but some of them know, they're better at going and translating back into conversations with more conservative communities. I'm better at helping those who are trying to get healed from conservative Christianity, and those who find themselves already in pretty serious conversation with with various other religions, with various secular discourses, with modern art. So it depends on those communities. I don't think I could last as a Christian in any important sense very long unless there were those communities. I would always, till when I die, recognize the wisdom that I've gleaned from the teachings of Scripture and in some specific ways of Jesus, but I wouldn't identify with that movement except in as much as it still stays alive and anti-exclusionary.
Right. Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it reminds me, I got my MFA in poetry, and and just something that the way you were talking about, like discovering maybe writers and communities that kind of, maybe the way I think about it is like giving permission. For me, with poetry, I read certain poets that give me permission to do certain things with poetry that I maybe didn't even realize were possible. And it's the same thing sometimes with spirituality. It's like you discover certain people or communities that kind of give you permission to do things with the spiritual life that you didn't realize were possible.
Right.
And
sharing more resources with each other.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
Give that permission. There's a poem I might share with you if we have a chance. That's one of those resources.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Well, I wanted to make sure to ask this question because it is one of the first ones that I wrote down to ask you. And I'm sure that you've, maybe you're asked this often, but basically I'm curious, like, as a feminist, how do you kind of approach the Old Testament and certain traditional notions of like God the Father? How do you approach that with your own perspective? Like, if that makes sense. I mean,
of course it does.
Yeah.
I mean, that was like the issue in a sense.
Yeah.
Everything else is just a distraction if that isn't addressed. And, as I was getting into these questions, 16, 17, 18, I only could because I was hearing from within the study of what was then called the Old Testament. First, that's where I first got formally academically involved as a freshman. I had a great class in the Old Testament, Hansen at Harvard. And even he was lifting up some of the images of the divine as female in the so-called Old Testament, First Testament. And that's especially the image of God as Chokhmah, wisdom. The divine Sophia is how she's translated into Greek. And she's fully an expression of a term for the divine. So there had to be those hints and clues for me that were right in scripture. And I was reading it contextually. I understood that, this was a very patriarchal world into which, the Hebrews came and formed their communities and became Israel, et cetera. And that if they weren't patriarchal, they would have just been wiped out. And there were lots of forms of imperial religion that were patriarchal, but that had lots of images of goddesses too.
Right.
Just having female images of the divine doesn't make the religion less patriarchal. I mean, think of Zeus or Jupiter. I mean, these are heavily patriarchal gods, but they are accompanied by Athena and Demeter and all these goddesses, and that doesn't solve the problem. So it's not just about the metaphors of gender. I got that. However, I couldn't say God the Father, and now I can, but as a metaphor among others. But like the United Methodist Church that I go to when I can, up the street from me in Manhattan, serious, nice, strong United Methodist congregation prays to our God in heaven, not our Father who art in heaven, right? And the pastors are feminists, white male, one of them, and a married lesbian, the other, even though that's still officially prohibited in our denomination, but we say no. So when I can really be part of a community, there's that attention to the language that one finds. It's not hard to find non-exclusive language and to substitute it. Then when you're reading the scripture, you quote it and you're talking about it in its time, in its patriarchal context. Of course, for Jesus, God was Father. That wasn't a way of reasserting patriarchy. That he called him Abba, Daddy. So in that patriarchal context, it was a way of expressing intimacy, closeness, of a daddy. It wasn't a way of asserting male power, but you have to do that contextual work, and then you use other images, and you use ones from other ages and a lot of contemporary work. And I wouldn't teach at Drew in the theological school if it hadn't been a hotbed of feminist religious thought for 50 years. And that's why they hired me. They were already wanting to move in that direction. I think that's 35, more than that, maybe 40 years ago almost. So, and I love that. I love that kind of that. So there are we don't just pick up the Sophia language, but sometimes you're just translating into the one or the divine. You can talk mother, you can go to Goethe for the divine feminine. And it's not that hard, but it's very hard if you're on your own working with the language. But it's only because I'm with people who also are working on it. And that doesn't mean we want to erase the masculine imagery for God. You'd lose too much with it. You'd even lose the motivation. Because a lot of that motivation for social transformation, for social justice, for oppressed groups, and now understood also to be women, is coming out of the prophetic tradition. And so, one learns a kind of complicated waltz. This way and the opposite way and the third way.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I do want to hear the poem that if you'd be willing to read it. I mean, my my last question, I don't know. I think we've kind of touched on it really, but infinity is something that I'm obviously with the title of my podcast and stuff, and I'm actually in the process of publishing. I'm about to publish a book called From Infinity to Personhood. And
Ooh.
so yeah, and in that book, I had done a lot of research on different spiritual and mystical traditions, and so I'm very interested in kind of like the notion of infinity becoming finite, or something like infinity expressing itself as all these finite forms, and in infinity expressing itself as people,
Yeah.
infinity to personhood, and kind of finding some sort of middle way between that, because I think that certain spiritual orientations that maybe emphasize infinity or things like that can get maybe too far away from like embodiment and manifestation in our own individual day-to-day lives. And then maybe the other side is like, if certain paths that emphasize only embodiment and don't kind of acknowledge infinity maybe fall into another type of trap. And I think that you had some quote from one of your podcast interviews. I think you said something like, this divine infinity in which everything lives and breathes and has its being. And so I guess if you're willing to maybe just briefly, like, because not every theologian uses the word infinity. It seems like infinity is in your vocabulary and you use it pretty often. So what is it about kind of this notion of infinity that resonates most with you?
Oh, I could answer that infinitely.
Yeah, I know.
That time is finite. But I think I'm delighted that you're writing this book, Matthew, and I
Thank
think
you.
it's capturing the tension there between a too limited capturing of meaning, if we focus merely on the finite, or a too shapeless, impersonal
Right.
sense of meaning if we only go infinite and boundless. So what's interesting is the way the energy of the universe pours itself infinitely into finite forms,
Exactly.
into what are an infinity of finite forms
Exactly.
through time. Certainly there is no bound, infinity, no fin, no the end. And what's great
Hmm.
about process theology, of course, one of the things I love is that there is no absolute beginning and no absolute end to the world.
Amen.
There's a big bang as a particular universe,
Yeah.
and no simple end. If our universe collapses into some great black hole, it'll probably emerge uh, as the energy for another one.
Yep.
So if we can keep that interplay of finite embodiment going endlessly,
Yeah.
infinitely, I think we're onto something, and something that's close to what we try to name with the divine, where the personal metaphors do keep the divine from being just impersonal and huge and somehow irrelevant.
Yeah.
It's the way of being in relation. We're persons, we want to be in relation to a person. But as Nicholas of Pisa said, theologian in the 1500s, or 1400s, excuse me, 15th century, he said, yes, persons relate to the infinite as a person, dogs
Mm.
as a dog, bulls as a bull, a stone as a
Mhm.
stone, relate to the infinite as a stone. So I love that. So
Yeah.
yeah, we relate through what we are. There's inevitable projection of our finite forms, but perhaps we can understand that projection and that relation as uh, finite embodiment of an
Hmm.
infinite creativity.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I think we're definitely on the same page about that. Um, So as a way to
Page.
close, yeah, right. As a way to close, I'm wondering, would you like to read the poem that you?
I'd love to read this poem.
Oh, excellent.
And it is from the 14th century, probably written around 1390. This is by Hafiz of Shiraz, Persia. So we're in an Abrahamic tradition here, the Sufi version. I just have come back to this poem a lot recently.
Awesome.
I have learned so much from God that I can no longer call myself a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Jew. The truth has shared so much of itself with me that I can no longer call myself a man, a woman, an angel, or even pure soul. Love has befriended Hafiz so completely. It has turned to ash and freed me of every concept and image my mind has ever known.
Gorgeous. Such a good way to end the podcast too. It's
And
a
it
nice,
doesn't contradict by saying I work as a Christian, and yet,
right.
and yet.
And yet, that's
Ashes.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Catherine, I really, really appreciate this. I really enjoyed it. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. This was, for me, a really enlivening conversation on a day when I felt a lot of things tugging me downward. You've been very healing, as I bet you are for so many who listen to your podcast. So thank you. We talk again.
That's really kind. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great day.
Gonna have a good walk.
Bye.